Hey, greetings, class. Today I have a classmate of mine, Dr. Kylie, and she's going to share with you a little bit about her background in regards to how she became a DSW and what her population of interest is. Today we're going to talk about the sexual exploitation and human trafficking. For me, because my background's child welfare, my interest is probably more kids, but also I think we have to look at it from a bigger context as well. And where we live in Kansas City, we're the center of the United States, and we have major highways, which human trafficking, it's the superhighway, whether it's I-70 heading east and west, or I-35 heading north and south down to Texas. We are the superhighway of human trafficking, smack dab in the middle of the country. So Kylie, please share with my class a little bit about who you are and kind of what makes you tick.
Yeah, I would love to. Hi, everybody. So I'm Dr. Kylie Lozama. I have been in the nonprofit social work scene for about 15 years. I did not grow up in the US. I actually grew up in Uganda, and my father worked for the International Red Cross. So I've always really had social work as kind of like ingrained in me. And my goal originally was to work with child soldiers specifically. So when I moved to the US, in undergrad, I started working at a nonprofit that worked specifically with youth that were in either involved in gangs or lived close enough to a gang neighborhood. So we were doing a lot of like at-risk work. And it was so interesting because I found kind of like my child soldiers in the US. I mean, obviously not the exact same scenario, but it really was just working with youth who had been recruited to do some unfortunately very awful things, and all the PTSD that was coming out of that. And so predominantly my career has focused on working specifically with gang members, but in doing so, I kind of, I had always known about human trafficking, and I had thought that I wanted to do something in that arena, but I was never really sure how you even got into that. And then it just so happened that it kind of fell into my lap based on the work that I was doing with a lot of the youth that were involved in gangs, because as it turns out, a lot of the trafficking is done by gangs. So in about 2015, I was hired on to be the clinician for a mental health program here in San Diego. And we worked specifically with survivors of human trafficking, which is a little bit different than commercial sexual exploitation, and we can review that in a minute. But yeah, so I worked specifically with victims of human trafficking, and then from there I was promoted to become the program manager for a Medi-Cal mental health clinic and drop-in center that served youth who were involved in both commercial sexual exploitation and human trafficking. So they could be either or. And really the difference between the two being that human trafficking requires force, fraud, or coercion. So typically you would have to see there would have to be a trafficker involved if we're doing human trafficking work, whereas commercial sexual exploitation doesn't require a third party person. It could be something that we would call like a renegade. So someone who is, and I'm going to put the word choose in quotes because it's really a choice of no choices, but quote unquote someone who's choosing to do this. So that's really where I got started in this. And then in doing that and being a program manager, I really saw that I wanted, like originally I just wanted to focus on micro level work, hence why I'm an MFT. But in doing my micro level, I realized how important it was to do a lot more macro level stuff. So that's why I entered the DSW program, because I really wanted to start working on policy stuff and what we're doing in the systems to help curb this, right? Because intervention-based work is great, but the problem is intervention means something is happening and we're helping fix it after it's happened, right? And so the goal being now, how can we prevent this so that this doesn't even have to be something that we need to be doing? So ultimately, that's really what led me down the DSW path.
All right. So class, one of the things we're going to talk about in regards to policy, you have a case study that you've read for class and an article about a policy decision in the state of Florida. But before we get to that, in the case study, and I'm curious, Kylie, if you can comment on this, one of the things that just, for me, being focused on child welfare for a really long time, is that when kids age out of the system, that's really awful, as opposed to being reunited with a family or being adopted. So one of those statistics in that case study that really speaks to my heart is that when victims are rescued out of human trafficking, the statistic is something astronomical, like 60% of them have child welfare or have been in foster care. That is just that blows my mind and hurts my heart so deeply. Before we jump into Florida, any thoughts about that statistic, Kylie?
Yeah, it's interesting that you brought that up because for me, I think same thing. Like when I first went into the field working with survivors of human trafficking, like in my brain, it was people who are being brought over from different countries, they're being chained and locked up. And then you start doing the work and you realize that it's really not. It's kids that we grow up with, it's kids that we see out about in the streets. And it breaks my heart because so much of the child welfare stuff is like how do I say this? I feel like a lot of the kids who are involved in human trafficking from child welfare get this reputation where they're seen as like a prostitute rather than a victim of human trafficking. And it's so frustrating because I feel like it places the burden on that child. Like it was that child's choice to end up in a scenario like this. And we forget about these are kids who had no healthy adult role models their entire lives. Like pimps know exactly, like these victims, I don't want to call it a joke, but like there was a saying that like these girls emit some sort of like scent that these traffickers know how to find them. And I apologize, I just realized I said girl. This absolutely happens to boys as well, but the work that we did specifically was with girls. So I just want to clarify that that's what I meant by that. But yeah, it was so interesting because again, like, I think sometimes there's this idea that even when a kid ages out of foster care, that like we've prepped them and we've given them these tools, but in reality, like we don't do anything. We give them a list of things that they have to accomplish, and then we say, okay, if you can do these, that means congratulations, you've graduated into adulthood. Good luck. But like we don't teach them self-regulation skills. We don't teach them self-advocacy skills. We don't teach them to look for red flags. And so these pimps see these girls or these kids, excuse me, and they're primed for the picking because these are people who desperately want to be loved and validated, and these pimps know exactly how to do that. And so unfortunately, I'm not surprised that like that statistic, as horrific as it is, does not surprise me because those are absolutely the best kind of victim. And the reason I say that is because that is the victim who's going to stay in trafficking far longer than a victim who was like wrong place, wrong time, kidnapped into that situation, right? Because if you're kidnapped, chances are you potentially came from a healthy background. It just happened to be wrong place, wrong time, right? Whereas if you're working with a kid in child welfare, we're talking about 15, 16, 17, sometimes 18 years of trauma in their lives. So it makes it much harder for those kids to want to leave that because as horrible as that trafficker is, that trafficker says, I love you. And that's the only person in their life that ever says, I love you. And so how do you even compete with that? So yeah, sorry, go ahead.
One time I heard an interview with Mother Teresa in India, and she was asked, what's the greatest human tragedy? And she said, without even pausing, the feeling of being unwanted, unloved, and unconnected. Well, when you grow up as a youth, maybe in child welfare or not, and you're unloved, unwanted, unconnected, you age out of the system, and then somebody comes by, flashes a little bit of money, and says how much they want you, that you're wired to be connected. So you become super vulnerable at that point.
For sure. And the two articles, I read the articles too. And I mean, oh my gosh, like even that victim, it's just like, she's a victim. Like she just wanted to be loved. Like, how do you fault someone for just wanting to be loved?
So let's talk a little bit about this relatively new policy in Florida, which, by the way, I don't know what your thoughts about it. I think if they can pull it off, it's a wonderful beginning point. But in the state of Florida, they passed some legislation that all kids from kindergarten through graduation of high school have to have curriculum in human trafficking. So from a 30,000-foot view looking down, what are your thoughts of that policy?
Yeah, great question. So as you know, my DSW project was focused on creating a video game that would be used in middle schools and high schools to teach youth about human trafficking. And in California, we had AB 1220 pass in 2017, I want to say, which mandates all middle schools and high schools in the state of California that are public. It mandates a human trafficking curriculum. So it's interesting that Florida has chosen to do it K through 12. Honestly, I love that it's K through 12. As somebody who works in that field, I have no idea how you can make the material digestible for a child, like a K through 5, like K through 5th grade. Like it's such a heavy topic. So I don't know how you would teach them that without I don't mean, I don't know what the answer is because I just have not seen that done before. The catch though is, that being said, most victims like that are recruited between the ages of 11 to 13. So yeah, you want to be talking to the K through 12 or the K through 5 because you want them to have those skills developed so that when they do hit that really vulnerable age, that they do have the tools behind them to say, you know what, no, I know what a red flag is, I know what to look for. So I love it. I would like to see what the actual practice itself would look like, because in theory that's a great idea. I mean, it's so easy to say, oh look at all these wonderful things that we're doing, but practice is very different.
I think that's a great point. I'm not sure how, I'm with you. I would love to see the curriculum for a K through 5th grade, because while those are important skills, how do you do it and not traumatize them in the
Exactly.
process?
Exactly.
And I think that's really important. Now, let's not go too squirrel for a moment, but let's go squirrel for a moment. I know that you used, gamification as a theory to help teach human trafficking to high schoolers in your thesis project. So talk a little bit about the value of gamification and how you think that is a really applicable, and then we'll get off the squirrel and we'll come back to center here in a second.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you. Yeah. Honestly, the video game thing, I hadn't really thought of it until I started. So currently my current job is I am an ERMS provider for 2 school districts here in San Diego. And ERMS is educationally related mental health services. So I'm not sure how it works in Kansas, but in California, we have 3 levels of, or 3 tiers of how educational services are provided. And then based on your needs is where you fall. And so ERMS is what's considered tier 3. So tier 3 is like right before residential facilities, right? So you meet with us with the hopes of that we can kind of help stabilize you and get you back into school. That being said, a lot of the kids that I work with fall somewhere on the autism spectrum, or just have such severe trauma that just having conversations sometimes is very triggering for them. And so what we found is video games are such a self-soothing activity for a lot of these kids. And I think it's that escape from reality, right? It's being able to take a break from your own personal life and the chaos happening in your life and being able to be another character. And so my goal really with that video game was just that, like it's being able to create, how would I say it? I am trained in like a million anti-trafficking curriculums. They're all great. They're wonderful if a client is ready and is in a place where they're ready to have that conversation, right? Because it requires a lot of dialogue about what's happened, what could happen. And, so for some people, talk therapy is not necessarily the way they get their needs met. And so for me, the video game was an interesting way of allowing children the space to explore and to kind of, I guess explore these different conversations around like, how does race impact whether or not you get trafficked? How does socioeconomic status, sexuality, gender identity, religion, all of those things? And so I wanted children to have an option to play any kind of character that they wanted, right? Because there are 6 characters and we tried to make them very diverse characters, with the idea being that maybe somehow you'll connect to one component of one of the characters, right? And the idea being that so in this video game, it's all choice based. So the curriculum, obviously there's an end goal in the video game, but how you get to that end goal is ultimately your choice based on the 3 options that are always available to you throughout the video game. And the idea being that kids are really getting to explore that, right? So they can find the natural consequence to a situation, but it's in a safe way of doing it because you don't have to actually go do it in the real world. Right. And that's really why I liked the idea of the video game, because again, it's your choice. You get to explore that. You get to see the consequences that are happening, and then you have a dialogue after. And in this way, the dialogue allows kids to not necessarily have to talk about their specific experience if they're not ready, but it allows them to talk about how they experience the feelings that their character experienced. And so that was really my goal, is creating a way for students to verbalize what's going on for them without having to necessarily call their specific story out. And it was interesting because we are still in the pilot phase of the game because surprisingly getting an anti-trafficking video game into a school is very difficult because a lot of parents are very resistant to the curriculum, completely understandable. But, obviously it's still necessary. But my point being that the few people who have played it had such a visceral reaction to what was happening to their character. And they would make comments of like, you gave me 3 options, but all 3 options were terrible options. And I just had to go with the best of the 3. And so having a dialogue of like, well, what does that look like? Because sometimes in real life, that is the situation that happens, Absolutely. Right? Like that one article that you had sent with the girl who had been both victim and perpetrator. Like, she didn't just like wake up one day and decided she wanted to perpetrate on other victims, right? Like, things happen that make that the only option available for someone, and it's important to understand that and build that empathy. And for me, that was really the end goal of this video game, is, if anything, like, just build compassion for another person's experience, and then hopefully in doing so you'll start to have compassion for yourself. So that was really where the gamification idea came from for me.
So we'll take this and we'll tie back into policy here. So in summary, class, Kylie is pointing out something really good. From a 30,000-foot view, requiring K through 12 is a great idea, but how do you pull it off for the very young kids? And more than likely, the people that authored that policy for sure are not going to be the ones pulling it off from the K through 5th grade. So the second article, class, that Kylie is referencing is an article, if you haven't already read it, it is about perpetrators or victims of prostitution who are arrested, who ended up in that position because they were initially human trafficked. So at the time of their arrest for prostitution, are they an offender, or are they a victim, and how should we treat them? And there is a very small change, very slow moving, slow growing across the United States, that we have to look at these individuals as victims rather than perpetrators. And it falls underneath the wicked problem of smart decarceration, but also trauma, and it ties in and connects to multiple levels. So what are your thoughts about that policy movement, Kylie, in regards to looking at prostitutes as victims rather than perpetrators?
For sure. So great question. So just a heads up, and I don't know if, just for clarification purposes, so we don't refer to victims as prostitute, and the reason we don't use that is there becomes this implied concept that if you're a prostitute, you are choosing to do this, and like I would just want to tattoo it on my head, like it's a choice of no choices, right? And so even when I was reading an article, it was interesting to see how they used the language and what kind of things they were saying and how much it's changed just in the last 5 years of doing this work, right? Like, I don't feel like I see the word prostitute as often as I used to. That being said, though, based on the article that you had sent, it is such an interesting situation, because even just, again, like in 5 years, so much has changed just in how we identify victims, how we support victims. And I don't know what the policy is in Kansas, but in California, if you are under the age of 18, you cannot be charged with solicitation. Only 18 and up can. And we're working right now towards decriminalizing quote unquote prostitution. And the idea being that if we can decriminalize it, more victims will come out and ask for help rather than getting in trouble and ending up in the prison industrial complex, whatever you want to call it. My frustration with this whole thing, though, is, how do I say it? I feel like in theory, a lot of people understand that the quote unquote bottom bitch, she's the top girl within a trafficking situation, right? So if a youth is being trafficked and there's a quote unquote a stable, which is what pimps or traffickers use to describe kind of like the family of where, like, the family of women that they have working for them. And I say women because that's, again, been the traditional model. Typically when boys are being trafficked, it's it's more of a line continuum. You don't really see that hierarchy that you do when it's a trafficker that's trafficking females. And so the bottom is, and so it would be trafficker, pimp, and then bottom, and then you have like the wifeys, who are all the girls that go out and who work. And the bottom doesn't necessarily have to see clients. It happens for sure, but the bottom definitely handles a lot more of like the money, handles discipline, handles consequences, handles everything. And she had to work her way up to that. And so that's where I get so frustrated when people are like, well, she chose to perpetrate on other victims. Like, she brought new people in. The amount of psychological damage that has to happen to a human being to have been a victim and then somehow think it's okay to now become a perpetrator is fascinating to me. And the fact that people can't have compassion for that person is mind-blowing. Like, this is a youth who is living through the most horrific experience I think someone can have, has found a way to survive it and quote unquote thrive in it, and now is getting punished. And it's just I don't know. I don't see those individuals as a perpetrator. Like, to me, that is a victim through and through. And it's a victim who unfortunately learned how to play the game and is now getting punished for playing the game. And like, it's one of those like damned if you do, damned if you don't type situations. And I just think like, I don't know. I that article broke my heart reading, because I just felt like this, like you read the story, so in the article that you sent, the trafficker gets to be on the sex offender registry for 25 years. This victim is now on the registry for the rest of her life. So how did the trafficker end up with a less severe sentence than this victim? And like, yes, again, you can say to me all you want about how she victimized other people. Let's remember at the end of the day, this was also a victim too. And punishing her isn't going to solve the problem. Like, you want to be able to rehabilitate her, right? So you want her to see herself as a victim. That is the goal. So I don't know, I have mixed feelings. I mean, I'm glad it seems like there is progress being made, but I would love to see a complete decriminalization of solicitation, because I just don't think it's fair.
I think probably part of the problem is the unconscious bias that all of us have, especially people outside social services in regards to this. This is a very bad case example, but I think it'll help for my class explain the point. I was referred to a boy in a foster home that was needing some therapy, so I go out and I'm meeting with the foster dad and the boy. And the foster dad says, well, I asked the foster dad, what are the issues? And the foster dad says, but he looks at the kid and he goes, he just steals all the time. He's just a thief. So the minute I hear that, I'm thinking when we're at Walmart or when we're at, Walgreens, he's, sticking candy down his shirt or whatever. So I say, well, tell me more about that. And then the dad says, almost every night he comes down into the kitchen and gets crackers without permission and takes them to his room. And I was like, that's stealing in your home? Because, we're sort of wired, Maslow's hierarchy of needs, to eat. And when you've been, terribly neglected in regards to food, and so you get food to eat because you're wired to do that, it's a survival skill. How is that stealing? And I just knew from the get-go this was going to be a bad placement. And this boy wasn't going to make it in the home because of the unconscious bias. I mean, this foster dad he looked at the kid and saw the kid as a thief. I looked at the kid and I see a victim who's figured out that he can't rely on adults to take care of himself. So he's become his own provider. Granted, you get in trouble eventually, I guess, if you go to Walmart and you shove candy down your pockets. But in the beginning, it's got to start somewhere. So you're absolutely right. She had to work her way up, and that was nothing more than survival. It's not like she was 9 years old and someone said, hey, what do you want to be when you grow up? And she says, I want to be the top girl in a stable. Yeah, nobody says that. Exactly. So, all right. Well, I thank you so much for your time today. I think it would be really helpful for my classmates. What I really want them to hopefully hear is that this field has changed so much, as you have reiterated, about the last 4 or 5 years. We have terms we've got to change. We've got unconscious biases that impact the way we create policy. And we've got to really think about policy not from just the 30,000-foot level, but literally at the micro level. And it's funny, in your practice, you started at the micro level and you went to the macro, but then you realize at the macro, you still got to be able to look down at the micro.
For sure.
So any couple things you want to summarize for my students, and then we'll call it a day?
Yeah, sure. Well, one, thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it. And I'm so glad that you're even having these conversations, because I think it's so important that everyone is really getting that message of what does a victim, I know, how do I say it? Always being mindful of really seeing the victim as a whole person. Like, if there's any takeaway from any of this, it's like, even with the traffickers, like I know you haven't seen any of my trainings, but like when I go do trainings, I'm so vocal in the beginning of when I talk about traffickers, I am not talking about people that I think are horrible human beings who are disgusting. Like, what you've done is awful. And do you need a consequence for what you've done? Absolutely. But a trafficker is also a victim in all of this, right? And so my point really being that in any scenario, just the takeaway being, try to see the person as a whole. What is going on for this person and big picture that is creating this specific scenario, right? Like no one wakes up and just wants to be a bad person. And so again, just in doing this work, remembering that, because sometimes it can feel so hard, and sometimes some of our clients can be incredibly frustrating, and it feels like they're just self-sabotaging, and a lot of it is they're just not used to success. So like just be mindful that success looks different for everybody, and just be a human being at the end of the day. That's why we're here.
I think that's a great recommendation for my students, because one of the things about policy is that we have to connect it to practice, and you're just talking about being client-centered, just
For
human,
sure, for sure.
and making sure we connect those pieces together. So,
Absolutely.
well, thank you so much, Kylie. I appreciate it so greatly.
Yeah, thank you so much. I really appreciate it too.